We'll start with Dr. Michael. John, I've got you. Sorry.
Okay. So these were both really wonderful presentations, and Professor Nielsen, you really provided, I think, a strong ethical framework and a blueprint for how research should be done, especially as more resourced regions of the world reach out to less resourced regions of the world. But I'm looking at Dr. Salvi's presentation. I guess you alluded to it in a couple of slides, but maybe you could provide us a little more granularity, a little more detail on how the ethical framework that the professor described to us might be utilized in funding decisions on individual protocols if you had equivalent scientific merit between two approaches and yet one adhere to more of the approaches that Professor Nielsen described. Would those kinds of proposals be the ones more likely to be funded?
I didn't report also on the role the European Group on Ethics is playing in the complex European machinery, because otherwise the 10 minutes were just exhausted. The European Group on Ethics is the only body, according to EU legislation, which can advise the European Commission in the fields of ethics of science and new technologies. The opinions being issued have then a reference value with regard all the different policy designs and also the evaluation of research trials being financed by the European Union. In this sense, the ethics frame which Professor Nielsen described, which is also reflected in the opinion adopted on clinical trials in developing countries, is used as a reference point for this case-by-case approach that I just described, when the research protocols financed by the EU are analyzed by external experts. Then the European Group on Ethics has provided the reference, let's say, basis, and this is one of the elements which is taken into considerations after the scientific evaluation of the research protocols, where scientific necessity, including of having international partners, is assessed scientifically. When there is the ethics review of these protocols, this ethics reference is taken on board and assessed with regard to the specific elements of the protocols being scrutinized. In this sense, I underline these case-by-case studies. And this is done by external experts with a rotation mechanism. Then we try to have not a kind of preconceived top-down approach in terms of a set of norms that have just to be evaluated in terms of compliance by expert groups, but to have also a critical analysis of each protocol to be analyzed with regard to the ethics implication, the scientific things, and also the specific peculiarity in the country where the research is carried out. Then, in this sense, this is used.
Actually, may I take some prerogative here to ask a question, and perhaps it's one that we can defer for the larger roundtable conversation. But Linda, you seem to address something that John Ayres mentioned before. He used the word cacophony, and you used the word harmonization, which would be just the opposite. But then you said, but not unity. And Maurizio, you also made reference to how you valued a set of minimum standards, but you didn't use the words highest principles. I just, and again, we can share this more broadly, but I'm wondering, what is it that sort of goes without saying that I haven't heard yet, that searching for some unity around highest principles would not be a valuable thing to do? Is it simply politically impossible, or is there really a practical and a good reason for it?
I think there are two reasons for it. One is practical, and one is of another kind. The practical is that it's very difficult. For instance, when you had a problem with the Helsinki Declaration, because if I understand it correctly, the placebo discussion or whatever, then I would say, is this discussion so crucial that it's worthwhile that you cannot have harmonization between the bigger areas of the world because of that? I would say no. I'd rather leave that to a lower level, so to say. And the other thing is that when I say that that why can't we have it all, then it's also because, as many have stressed here today and yesterday, you shall have to see things in context. Things are different in different kinds of country. They are different for each research project as such. And to try to make them fit into one scheme, I don't think that will be very helpful. And in that sense, that's why I'm trying to introduce different kinds of layers, where I'll only have some things in the top layer.
Just also another consideration. The fact of having universal principle is already, if we want to be realistic, on the table. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU is advocating principles that you can recognize in the UNESCO Declaration of Fundamental Rights, for example, in the Council of Europe Convention. The fact is not the principle, is how you implement the principles. And on this mechanism, you have huge diversities. And the European Union recognizes diversity because it's composed by diversity. I underlined is social, cultural, religious, and linguistic diversity the way we are. But at the same time, if you go for minimal universal standard, you just have to consider that these have to be minimal. They should result from what is already on the table, and I mean UN Declaration, UNESCO, WHO, or World Medical Association. They all have this common element, having in mind that the implementation phase of this, which translates into guidelines, is the level where the real differences appear and where the real priorities, also the different interlocutors, political, economic, private, emerge. Then in this sense, I wanted to respond.
It's also my impression from the UNESCO, and we can have that confirmed, that the developing countries are quite happy with having these very broad principles. Even if it's the lowest common denominator sometimes, and even if some say it's just little paper. It is, the principles are there. A consent is a consent. You can discuss to which kind, etc., but it's there.
No, I would agree. And I understand the difficulties of a definitive document relative to highest principles, or as you refer to them, minimal standards. John, I think you're next.
Yes, thank you very much for two splendid presentations. It's often said in the United States that the level of regulation, the level of complexity that researchers face here has led to, massive offshoring and outsourcing of research to developing countries in Eastern Europe, Africa, Asia. One distinguished researcher from Duke University came before us and questioned whether the United States was a fit place to do research these days. So the more demanding, the more complex your regulation of research, the less hospitable to research, pharmaceutical companies view a particular region. So you've described, I think, two very excellent approaches to the regulation of biomedical research in Europe, and I'm wondering if you are facing the same sort of hemorrhaging, the same sort of rush to developing countries that we are, and if so, are you doing anything about it?
And include Eastern Europe.
Well, that's a difficult. Yes. It's a difficult question. And I used to be a vice chancellor, so I know exactly what you say. We had a lot of persons coming to us saying this is much too complicated. And the interesting thing is that from Europe, many Europeans would say, well, we tend to go to the US. It's much easier there to make research. It's much easier to get patents. Oh, yes, absolutely. So that's where you start. And then you can say from there, they can go to developing countries and to other places. So this kind of moving around tourism, Yeah. Well, I'm not saying that what you're doing is wrong. I would never dream of that. Hey, come on. But I'm just saying that this is what we sometimes hear. And the patenting is different, that's for sure. I'm not valuing which is better, they're different. But I think that somehow we shall have to take into account that this will always happen. And that's why at the end of the day, the optimal thing to do was to get anybody on board. We all know that will take a long time, if ever, but that's what we're trying to aim at. But we can't say that we won't have those principles because then we'll move elsewhere. I don't think that's a valid argument in a way.
From Linda, you will get the intelligent response. From me, just the factual response about how the situation is. Then, with regard what is done by the European Commission, of course. What you have described is the fact of what is happening with European research being financed by the European Union. There is a growing rate of international clinical trials going to these regions of the world. At the same time, there is a need that has been recognized by the different research agencies being associated to the program also to try to have sharing of information and common partnerships. With regard to the ethical review of clinical trials, the reason why it has been requested in the European Union Framework Programme that all research activities financed by the EU cannot contravene fundamental ethical standards and principles, it was because, having in mind this internationalization of research, it was needed not to have different standard in ethics for the European participants and from participants of other regions of the world. Then it was requested legally, before having the financing, that if there was an international partnership being established, then fundamental ethics value as described in the legal frame of the framework program and the mechanism of monitoring, auditing all this were to be established in the clinical trials, insofar this was sponsored by the European Union public spending, the framework program. What is now happening is that this current framework program for research is going to end because 2013 is the end. We are talking about a budget of 53 billion euros. Now there is the current debate about the next framework program for research, and with an idea of having substantial increase of budget. The global dimension is recognized as a priority for both basic research and clinical research. And the need of having also a global debate about the relevance of ethics into this new dimension is recognized. And you gave me the opportunity to ask Professor Goodman of Wagner to participate in September. We are going to have a conference with these 42 countries about how the notion of responsibility impacts into research innovation, including the clinical element of that. Because we are trying to keep the link between ethics, innovation, clinical trials, and all different areas of research in a way that is all the time respecting of this global approach, but also the respect of fundamental values. Then this is happening, is going to happen even more, and this is the response that at the moment has been done. Bureaucracy is something everybody is just complaining for. And if you have seen the slide about the revision on the clinical trials directive, one of the main criticisms is the number of papers that have to be filled to have authorizations by this. This is something that we are trying to simplify, but is also a common complaint for everything which is done at the public level, at least in the EU.
Christine, our last question before we go to roundtable.
Am I on? Okay. I want to ask you something that you actually didn't address, but I hope that you can say something about. My understanding is that there's a fair amount of research, U.S.-funded research, that's collaborative with European collaborators, sometimes dually funded, and maybe conducted even somewhere else in the third place. So my question to you is, for research that is at least partially supported by the U.S. government, what are the biggest challenges from the European perspective in terms of these kinds of issues, human subjects protection?
That gets to the
In the slide I've introduced, I said that there are some elements where some, let's say, I don't want to say differences, but where some diversities materialize. Yeah. These apply not only to this collaborative research EU-US, but also EU and other regions of the world. Just to be precise, I refer that this free non-profit participation on human subject in clinical trials is required by the EU. There are other regulations in which it is not indicated this as a precondition for an ethics review approval. I indicated the fact that there are data protection issues. There are other regulatory frames in which the consent for the use of data and, for example, epidemiological study and all these things for other uses than the consented one are not required. In the EU, this is the case. I refer the fact of protection of vulnerable groups. We do have a reference in the framework program to the Council of Europe biomedical research protocol, where specific provision on protection of vulnerable groups are indicated. These provisions are not, let's say, identical everywhere in the world, in terms in particular of research involving incapacitated people and several other areas. I referred about open access. Open access is requested for all research protocols being financed by the European Commission. And this may be problematic for the patenting issue when private enterprise are involved. Again, this is not an element that is reflected in other regulatory frame. I also referred about the need of having the approval of local research ethics committee as a precondition for patenting. Again, this is not a requirement in other regulatory frames. All these elements are not a sign of a more sophisticated versus a more liberal approach, are just a sign of different regulatory frame coexisting. And these apply to the case you also have mentioned, such as other international clinical trials where the co-financing is foreseen with the EU and other regions of the world, from China to India to South America and so on and so forth.
One follow-up to that question. So is the resolution of that problem a case-by-case analysis, as you said earlier? In other words, the fact that different jurisdictions have different rules about these particular items, for example, how do you resolve that? Is it case-by-case decision about whether it's okay to go?
What is requested is that the minimal ethics standard apply when there are also different actors, and I mean research center in different regions of the world. The case-by-case approach is that, having in mind that the hard law requires this to be implemented, it will be up to the ethics committee to evaluate according to the features of the different clinical trials being evaluated, where in the countries where the research is carried out, this is the case or not. And then when there are the outputs, and I mean authorization of the market for medical products, or the licensing, or the attribution of the patent, it will be to their own committee about these independent bodies to evaluate that the file is fulfilling this requirement. And the case by case is the assessment of the different elements, having a common line being defined even before the clinical trial starts, and even before even different country research centers decide to make an application. If you want to do it, you have to follow this game, and then it will be evaluated by...
Linda, did you have something very quickly
Yes,
before?
yeah, very quickly. I think there are two elements in it. One is, do we try to harmonize on the basic principles? Another is, if you make cooperation, will we then have the standards where you follow both? Because if you have that, you still have your problem. And my question would be, what do the U.S. researchers think about the European rules?
No, that's fair. Well, again, with wonderful thanks to you, we'll...